you're in lockdown, that you're having a good day. I wanted to start by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here in Canberra, and pay my respects to elders past and present. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and of course sovereignty was never ceded. We do these webinars at least weekly, but the days and times do vary. So head on over to the australiainstitute.org.au to find all our upcoming events and webinars, and you can register for them. They're all for free, but we do just ask you to register so you can find them all coming up there. Just a few tips before we begin to help things run smoothly. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can ask questions of our panelists and also upvote other people's questions and make comments. Just a reminder to please keep things civil in the chat or we'll boot you out. And finally, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and it'll be posted up on the Australia Institute's YouTube channel, and you'll be able to find it on the website within the next 24 hours. So thanks so much for joining us today, everyone. The Australian arts and entertainment sector is just a powerhouse in the Australian economy, but that's really quite misunderstood. It employs close to 200,000 Australians and contributes $14.7 billion to gross domestic product annually. The arts and entertainment sector employs 4 times as many Australians as coal mining and as many people as the entire finance sector, yet its economic contributions continue to be poorly understood. So it's an absolute economic powerhouse, but it's been really hit hard by the pandemic. And if you're anything like me in lockdown, we're absolutely relying on watching stories, in particular Australian stories. And if you're anything like me, you've been absolutely binging up a storm to make it through lockdown. I can't handle anything too intense at the moment. So I've recently been enjoying Rosehaven and Aftertaste and Back to Nature on ABC and The Family Law on SBS. Those are about my speed at the moment. And our local content requirements for television have really delivered that quality Australian content and Australian stories for decades. But now with the streaming services coming on board and huge take up from within the Australian community, it's really crucial that streaming services like Netflix and Disney Plus and Amazon Prime and Apple are required to tell Australian stories too. But there really are no requirements on them to produce local content. So today I'm delighted to bring into this discussion our 2 guests today. Matthew Diener is the CEO of Screen Producers Australia, and Erik Thomson will be, I'm sure, a familiar face to many of you, whether it's from Pack to the Rafters or Aftertaste on TV. Erik is one of Australia's most respected actors across film, television and theatre. He's just getting into being a producer as well, from what I understand. And I'll note that in doing research for this, I saw the trailer for his new film, Coming Home in the Dark, which looks downright chilling if you're like me and are a massive fan of horror. I can't wait to check that one out. Matthew and Erik, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, Ebony, how are you?
Matthew, I'll start with you. Obviously, the whole arts and entertainment sector has really been struggling during the pandemic. But for people who aren't really familiar with the industry, can you just start by explaining to us a little bit of the problem that you're encountering and why local content rules don't apply to streaming services?
Yeah, look, thanks, Ebony. Look, let me just start also by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land. We're so fortunate in this nation to have some amazing storytellers that actually go back in the first storytellers, 60,000 years or so plus, in terms of the rich cultural heritage that we've got in Australia and want to share with the world. So our industry is an interesting one. It's a project-based industry where people come together, form teams, deliver the content that we're all enjoying. And, you know, I'm as guilty as any as probably having the same taste as you, but I have to give a shout out also to the newsreader. But Aftertaste was fantastic, great comedy, delivered right at the right moment. Well done, Erik. Teams of people coming together, a lot more people than people realise that are employed through those teams. And we might touch on that later. In the pandemic, the problem originally was we didn't know how to put people together in the same room, did we? And one of the things that's been okay through this period for us has been some protocols and some little bits of support that have meant that our industry, compared to maybe parts of the other creative industries, has been able to keep functioning, not without its challenges. moving people around's hard, border closures, all of those things. But we've been able to keep sort of plodding along. The biggest problem, though, and you alluded to it, is that the whole basis by which our industry has been created in Australia, and it's the same challenge globally, is that you need to have support structures to build our industry from. They come through, I call them the carrots and sticks. You need an element of carrots to incentivize people to work, and that's really good investments from government because it builds other investments, private investments. So we're an industry that's quite a challenge to take a risk on. So the little bits of seed money come together and then they create the whole production, and that we've been able to work through that prism. But the most important element is the requirements for different businesses that would otherwise not invest in local television, particularly drama, children's content and documentaries, that they have absolute rules around what they do to have to deliver those stories. Because, and you know, if we step back a minute, the problem for us is that we are an English language nation in which there is a substitutability for our story from the American sort of huge machine of the studio system that can deliver into our market content that is purchased by people supplying it to consumers for very cheaply. It's essentially already monetized in other markets, so it effectively gets dropped into our market very cheaply. So there's a competition issue always on the ground in terms of how we might make our own content, and so we've always needed rules for the systems of delivery to consumers in Australia and then, you know, also hopefully to the world, by which there are requirements to show content. And as we're seeing, and I'm rambling on a bit, but the structure of that is changing dramatically as we move away from the traditional broadcast model of watching things to more and more, as we all are, Netflix, Amazon, Disney Plus. And those new platforms, who are really quite dominant in the market now, haven't got any rules. And the question is, well, why is that? And part of it's a game of catch up, and part of it is that it's a conflicted policy space, in that the businesses that are in Australia delivering now a lot of content to everyone don't want to have those rules. So there's a battle royale happening in government, I suppose, at the moment to work out how to implement those rules and make sure we get to a good result. We can get into the detail of what that result would look like, but that is really what's happening at the coalface. And it's not that this is a new problem, because they've had 4 reviews actually in government to basically say this is what you should do. So we're just playing a game of come on, let's get going. And the risk is that other territories are already doing these rules, and so the global investment from those big players will start to kind of go into the territories where there are rules already. So Australia's got a job to get self-organised and deliver this stuff and get moving. In a nutshell.
Erik, I'll come to you next. You're obviously a working actor across both Australia and New Zealand, but I wondered if you could just kind of take us behind the scenes a little bit. Australian film seems to be doing okay during COVID because we've had so few cases. But, how important are local content rules behind the scenes in terms of driving investment in productions of the likes of TV shows and things that you've worked on?
G'day, I'm coming to you from Ghana country down here in South Australia. And I think on one level we've been doing really well. In terms of production during the pandemic. Certainly last year, the beginning of this year, the government put up a lot of money to incentivize foreign productions to come down here and shoot. I think it was $400 million. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, to bring foreign investment. Of course, that all flooded into the country, and then we've kind of seen recently things get a little bit more tricky with the Delta strain, and particularly in New South Wales, and quite a lot of those productions have now left, and quite a lot of the people who came flying over here to be part of it have gone. So it was very much a kind of band-aid measure on something that perhaps could have, that amount of money could have really been spread out within our own industry to keep the smaller productions working and to push our industry forward into the future, because certainly there's a lot of competition, and I think given the fact that free-to-air networks are making less drama, and the streamers aren't required to make a lot of drama at the moment, or even I don't think required to make any drama at the moment. So what you end up with is a lot of stuff in development, whether it's funded development or it's actually being funded by the funding bodies, all fighting for that small amount of money. And some of that will be lucky enough to make it into production, but certainly during the pandemic, there's been a real bottleneck of that. Like I said, the amount of money available seems to be shrinking, and the amount of people wanting it seems to be growing. So we really are at a crossroads in terms of the way that people watch television, no longer on the free-to-air networks. And this has only happened in the last half a dozen years, really, and since our national broadband network was fast enough for streamers. It's only really 6 years, so we're really trying to work out what the best systems are. But certainly, we need to find a way of making funds more available to our production companies to produce the high quality work that we know that they're capable of.
Yeah. I was just going to say, Matthew, can you give us a picture of how big the streaming services are and how much they produce content and how little of that is,
Yeah, it's massive. It is. No, it's a good point. And Erik's just hit the nail on the head. The issue is it's a question of making sure Australia gets its fair share of what is actually a reasonably huge business. So altogether, the three major ones, which are Disney, Amazon, and Netflix, they are spending in Australian dollar terms about $37 billion a year. That's the public information on new content. And it's just been released. They were asked by the government to, account for how much they're doing in Australia. And they mentioned, the report so far is that they're doing about 122 million in Australia. So if you're a statistician, that'll be, sounds like a lot. It's actually 0.3% of their overall expenditure. So you go, hang on, we're only getting 0.3% of these big businesses that we're all signing up to and we're investing in terms of our subscriptions. And our model is to say, well, hang on, that's not enough. And it's inconsistent because the thing that, Erik's someone who can testify to this. The problem for the sector is it wants a stable pipeline of work. And then you have people that are secure enough to develop projects and stay with the industry and not move away from this sector or have to travel overseas or to live in Los Angeles, which has kind of been one of the challenges for us if we don't have enough going on. So we're saying, well, actually raise your game here. Let's get up to a point, and we're only asking for what would ultimately be about 1% of their, as a sort of a benchmark safeguard for our industry, 1% of their global expenditure, which equates to about $360 million of investment each year into local Australian stories. So it's kind of, it's not that much more, but it would be a huge amount in terms of what it would deliver onward for the industry, because that would lift us into about 10,000 more ongoing permanent jobs. It would create about, another 10,000 hours of content, or 100 hours, I should say, of content each year. So these things are kind of big opportunities for us to not just stabilize the industry and grow ourselves into a different space, because we've been, I think, if the benefit of being in a global world is that we get to tap into that, but if we could also get swamped by it. So we're kind of going, hang on, this is now what we used to be small broadcast space. We're in a global environment. Let's make sure we get the opportunity to launch ourselves into that space and not be swamped by all the deluge of content.
Yeah, well, the news is...
Sorry, if I could just jump in there. Sorry, Ebony. I just think it's important that, and I think none of us want to demonize the streamers, because they're certainly, we all enjoy the work that they produce and that we can be part of. I think it's more, and they're big businesses, and they're able to come in here and they see a fantastic business opportunity. It's more to do with what they're finding when they get here, which is, a very, very good business opportunity, because there's no kind of restrictions or stipulations or requirements for them to be here. And it's tax. Very, very, or tax. It's a very, very profitable, and it's just a case of just introducing, like in any other of the big industries in this country, if we were to suddenly drop all the tariffs and the duties at the border and say all the wool and all the meat and just come on in, do whatever you like. We're not going to tax you. We're not going to you don't even have to employ anyone. The government, it would be a bloodbath. The government would be out in a day. It's not happening in our business because our borders are in the cyberverse, and it's easy for it to happen. And like I said before, the national broadband network, which has cost us, 50 billion plus of taxpayers' money, has provided the perfect environment for the streamers to work. And like I said, being great business people as they are, they've seen a great opportunity. We just really want to make sure that there is the similar protections in our business as there are in every other industry in Australia.
Yeah, and I was just going to say the Australia Institute's done a bunch of work in this space, and we've just released some polling that shows Australians definitely back your proposal, Matthew. In fact, probably a lot less modest than what you're proposing is. So we polled a representative sample of about 1,000 Australians and found that 3 in 5, or 60%, of Australians support requiring subscription video on demand services like Netflix and Amazon to spend at least 20% of their revenue on Australian content. And we also found that about 7 in 10 Australians use at least one type of service like that. Netflix is by far the most popular, but people are also concerned about things like children missing out on history and culture due to the prevalence of American content on those kinds of platforms. And I thought it was interesting that really that type of concern cuts across political lines as well. So it's really clear that there's a lot of support out there for the types of things that you're proposing there. Matthew,
well done on that research too. I'll just give you guys because it's a really important conversation that you're able to add to the national discussion at the moment. So sorry, over to you, back.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, we have seen the government kind of paying a little bit more attention in this space. It's had a couple of inquiries, as we've referred to, but the communications minister, Paul Fletcher, I think you touched on the figures that they'd released, that they'd asked for from the streaming services about how much that they are actually spending. But he's had a few more comments about this recently that indicates that the government is seriously looking at this issue. Do you think the government really gets the problem and is going to be willing to act on it?
Look, I think they're starting. Look, I think there's a getting a handle on it is been a process for a number of years, and I think the natural tendency sometimes is to see whether or not you have to regulate the market and wait to see what's going to happen. And our concerns have always been, and we sort of start to see it, if you wait too long to do these things, or if you let it drop too far, you lose a lot of people and businesses in the process. So we've been wanting to push and make sure that the government's really onto it. And I think we're seeing, you're right, there's been a green paper that was announced. It was all the sort of starting points for the conversation were very small, light touchy style regulation proposals, which ultimately won't get us the cultural or economic value that we need. So, when I was referring to, 1% before, that was 1% of their global spend. We're saying that would translate to about 20% of the revenues they receive in this market, which is consistent with what you're saying. And we would think that's a good benchmark. The government's suggesting at the moment 5%, or it's posited whether 5% would be the right level. And we've gone, no, that's not even kind of probably where they're at the moment. And we need it to be a proper investment for all the reasons we're talking about. I think this is then an opportunity, as you've touched on, that to us to show that people really care about the content they receive. And we know that that's true, because if you give people great, well-made Australian content, back to the Rafters being a great example there, it's just launched, it is stuff that they would absolutely prefer to watch because it's their own stories. And there is a deep concern, I think, in most cultures, not just Australia, but everyone's interested in the world, but they want to make sure that they understand themselves and that their children and their community is communicating with each other through story, and that I don't think any government would want to be the demise of that. So it's really then tinkering around, well, how do you get the best result in a regulatory sense based around the challenge of these very large businesses starting from a position of not wanting to be regulated, of course. And that's a natural position for a big business that has already entered the market to go, well, we don't want to be regulated, and putting a lot of pressure probably on government to say, well, don't regulate us. And at the same time, commercial television, who are building their own businesses in this front with Paramount Plus or Stan for Nine or Binge for Foxtel, they're also saying to government, don't regulate these new businesses. So there's a lot of pressure on the government. And I guess our job as an industry and the public, and maybe people that are watching today, is to also put their voice out to government to say, actually, this is really important to me. I want to know that we have great Australian stories being made. I think this is a great economic story to tell. It's great to see Erik on screen. Why don't we see more of him every day? So many different productions. So, those stories. And we have at the moment also a site that we should mention to people. It's called makeitaustralian.com. I think it's Make It Australian if you just type Make It Australian in. And it's a vehicle for understanding a little bit of these issues behind the scenes, and also an opportunity for people to, write to their local politician and just say to them, well, actually, this matters to me, and it matters to the future of the nation. Because I think if you take away our Australian story, you kind of take away Australia in the process, and then we're kind of not operating as a kind of a bound, understood, cultural nation anymore.
Yeah. Erik, I wanted to come back to you. Obviously, we know you as an actor, but we touched on there the fact that you've kind of entered the scene as a producer as well. I just wondered if you could take us kind of behind the scenes for those of us who just watch TV and aren't involved in it. Obviously, the Australian Institute's research has shown what a massive employer it is. It's quite equal in terms of employment for men and women. It's very equal in those terms. And it's very jobs intensive, but on something like Aftertaste, like how many people are involved in that? What types of jobs are there in a TV production besides actors?
Oh, look, it covers so many. I mean, with Aftertaste, I've very much got my training wheels on as a producer and working very closely with Closer Productions here in Adelaide, Rebecca Summerton and Matthew Bate, who, do the bulk of the work. And I'm learning a huge amount about, just seeing that what we see on screen is very much the tip of the iceberg. We produced 6 half-hour episodes of Aftertaste Series 1, and it took us about 2.5 years of development to get to that point. And that was one of the things that the ABC were very, very good with us, was making sure that development was done. So there's a lot of time spent before you even start to think about employing people in the wider sense. And in the case of Aftertaste Series 1, obviously you've got in a crew, you employ people from electrics and grips all the way through to makeup artists and set dressers and everything. But what we found with our production, and we shot in August last year, just coming out of the back end of the first big wave of the pandemic, was we were employing chefs and hospitality workers who didn't have any work. And suddenly they were working on set, preparing food for us, desserts, and perhaps, although I'm not going to give any secrets away, perhaps even standing in for me with my knife skills, which may or may not have been me. And so, we were moving it out into the community. And I think that, touching on the whole thing of Australian stories to be seen, it's also that classic thing of seeing your stories being told and people walking past productions and the pride that they have in presenting their houses for locations or their businesses for locations or being extras. There is still a degree, I mean, we know it's hard work, and sometimes people will come and work on sets and go, oh, this is a bit dull, or this is a bit cold, or I'm a bit hungry, or I don't know, whatever. Everyone gets well looked after, I hasten to say. But there's always a great community spirit behind making stuff. And in the case of Aftertaste, as part of the ABC, which is a national treasure, it's an absolute, very, very important, part of our culture. The desire to move productions into and make sure that they're spread evenly throughout our country. So South Australia, we're seeing the Mystery Roads, etc., getting made up in WA, and things are being made in Tasmania, and really we're allowing the culture of the entire nation to be represented on screen. So yes, it does employ a lot of people, but I think it does go much deeper into that pride of being part of telling our own stories. And I know sometimes that can sound a bit sycophantic, but it's just the truth. It's just the truth, and you see it in people's faces. So yeah, it's very important that we make sure that those opportunities aren't lost as we transition into the streaming world.
Yeah, absolutely. You just think about how much, productions like Kath and Kim or The Castle or Muriel's Wedding, all those beloved, local productions that just really enter the lexicon. We've all said, how's the Serenity a million times while camping and, nice, different, unusual, all of that kind of stuff. You're so right that people, can really see themselves in those types of productions. I know Black Comedy on SBS seems to have been generating huge amounts of upcoming talent on the comedy scene and others as well. Matthew, I'll come back to you.
It's a good point. And maybe just in terms of the pride and almost repositioning of Tasmania is in different ways has come from things like Mona, the investment in the cultural centre there, but Rosehaven, it repositions a national kind of interest in small community quirkiness that really speaks to people. So it does so much for the community there. And I think don't hack it on the main. It couldn't hack it on the mainland. It's probably becoming one of those touchstones as well.
And yeah, it's travelled really well as well, because it's so implicitly Australian, whilst having universal themes. And so we can brand ourselves as being an Australian production, but we can still talk to the world. And we don't want to lose that, because we have to sell our productions as well. So Rosehaven's a great example.
Yeah, that was going to be what I was going to ask about next. Because clearly Australian stories resonate with us. Mystery Road, for example, that you were talking about, is just a great, look at so many different parts of the outback. It's kind of that genre that Australia does, I think, really well. But those types of stories, even though they are such Australian stories, there's obviously huge potential we've seen with things like Bluey, for example, but Rosehaven is another there. They do well internationally as well.
Yeah, there's a great opportunity here, and it's not to. I think Erik touched on it as well. It's not to demonise the opportunity that I think the streamers or some of them are seeing in the market at the moment, but because they are putting in, I'd suggest not enough, but they're starting the investment process. But I think that if we're not careful, the investment process for them would naturally start with, look, this is a risky thing. I don't really know the local thing. Can we just do another, maybe Marvel production here, or can we maybe do something that's got a lot of Americans sort of in the mix of the story, or it kind of doesn't necessarily localize the story particularly, and then I think it takes a greater engagement or a deeper knowledge and maybe a greater risk to go, well, we're actually going to do a small town story in Tasmania about this community, about a real estate agency, even though the money might not be there. So I think you've got to kind of push at that, but I think the reward is so big, because it's always been those smaller, when you get the story right, and Erik talked about the development, I think people don't realise how many years of solid work and money that isn't necessarily sitting around very much that takes to get the project up to a point where it can then be produced. That confidence of having the streamers' resources with us on those journeys to develop shows like Rosehaven, like the films that we've all had in the past that we resonate with, The Castle, Studio Ballroom. Those are the stories that actually pinpoint the cultural lexicon and showcase us globally. And I think it's been the opportunity of working with the streamers potentially is that they are seeing maybe more and more the data that we aren't yet seeing, but of how a show like Rosehaven might perform globally. And but then there's another challenge where we've got to make sure that we can be found on a huge library service, and the rules in other territories are starting to, different territories, and we're not talking about we're talking about comparable territories to Australia in terms of the type of content, culture, and the systems of creation. But they're sort of inching towards, and some of them jumping very far forward to rules around library quantity needing to be local, rules around investment into local markets, and also discoverability, so that you don't just lose it. And I think we've probably all experienced this, where you go, oh God, I've got this library of Netflix or whatever, and I just can't find things. Well, gradually, and we're seeing, different tabs on things, and we're seeing how we can locate things better and better. And I think we've got to have a system and a structure around what we expect from these businesses also in this market, so that we don't get lost, and the stories are also able to be, as you say, tapped into globally. Because I think that's right. The more that people discover our culture, the more I think the opportunities are, but we've got to kind of push people to do that.
Yeah, we might go to questions from the audience shortly. I can see we've got a few hundred people on the line with us today. Thanks so much for joining us. I've got a question here from Zach Gillum, who says, what quotas exist for streamers in other territories? Surely there are some precedents that we can draw on. Matthew, I might direct that one to you.
Yeah, so there's a rule around library quota. So in Europe, they have a rule that says that about 30% of the library of the streaming services in all over those parts have got to be European, and that's been also adopted in the UK. And then there's a rule that is an expenditure obligation on local content, in a nutshell, in different territories. The market leader is France. That is sitting at 25.5% of their local revenue needing to be reinvested in different ways. It's kind of the sub rules around all of this. And importantly, they also make sure that most of that's invested in local businesses to produce the content, because that's what we are in Australia. We're a set of local businesses that operate all around the country. And so when you have a local business, you create a route system into the environment in which you're operating in Adelaide or Perth or Canberra or anywhere, and that employs people and it builds the community. So that's something that the French have done quite well. We've seen that Italy is moving from, I think, 12.5% to about 25% in the next couple of years. And we've seen the signal that, and indeed that Canada's heading down this path as well. They've had a break in the electoral cycle, and so there's some bit of legislation that didn't go through, but they've been very clear that they're doing this. So they're our comparable territories. One of the challenges, and Erik would know this well, is that the New Zealanders gave away their right to regulate their broadcasters in a way that Australia didn't, as part of a trade arrangement. And it's a shame, because it's created opportunities on some fronts for New Zealand, but it hasn't created maybe necessarily the same benefits that Australia's got. So anyway, that's kind of the map of the landscape. And I think that our position really is that we should get on with this, because global budgets are being set, and we want to be at the forefront of making sure that what would otherwise be a difficult geographical location for us to get to is always going to be a pipeline of work that we can ensure is happening in Australia. And really, we're talking about safeguards that ensure that we continue to be able to operate and not lose our people to other territories, essentially.
Yeah, the next question here is from Mel Smith. She asks, why do governments focus so much on sport than the arts in this country, especially with our current government, and what is required to make that cultural shift, or is it too deeply ingrained? Erik, you've been in the industry a long time. Obviously, Aussies love their sport, probably Kiwis too. Are we losing that balance? Is there too much of a focus on sports compared to the arts?
Look, it's such a hard question to answer, because I don't really know anything else. I've brought up in New Zealand. I've lived in Australia for 25 years. Sport is at the forefront of our culture in many ways, in terms of it's live sporting events. You can't binge watch grand finals. You've got to be there on the day. That's the immediacy. That used to be the case for Australian drama, because the only way you could actually watch Australian drama was when it went to air. There was no catch up. You had to be there 7:30 on a Tuesday night to watch Back to the Rafters, back in the day. I do think, and I think that it's been highlighted during the pandemic. Obviously, the governments, the state governments bent over backwards to make sure that the football season continued, and we were lucky enough to be able to watch the grand final, in Perth and in front of a crowd of 60,000 people. And I think that's been a little bit of salt into the wound for a lot of this, especially the live performers in Australia, because given that we've had a lot of difficulty as an industry getting access to JobKeeper funding and that kind of stuff, that was because of the way that we are paid and the ups and downs of our financial situation. It's kind of caused a little bit of polarization and perhaps, like I say, rub salt into the wound. But I think a lot of these the answers to a lot of our questions come down to how much do we actually value the work, Australian products. And it's like air. We don't actually see it. We don't realize how much of it we consume. And Australian content all across the ABC, but all of the shows that you can think of growing up as a kid, whether it be Play School or the Crocodile Dundees or Muriel's Weddings or Strictly Ballrooms, all these films that became synonymous with this country, and we had similar ones in New Zealand. We just take it all for granted. It's actually there, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It requires skills and funding, and the people that are involved in it are passionate, creative people who have, in many cases, chosen a very risky profession, as I'm constantly told at dinner parties. Oh, must be very unstable. It's like, well, yeah, it is, but it shouldn't be, because I think everyone watches Australian content. Not everyone likes AFL.
Yeah.
I'll end with that.
The next question I've got is probably for you, Matthew. Again, it's from Mel Smith. Why is there a lack of diversity in our media landscape? I watched the ABC series on racism. I'm not sure if that's the one about the school that tried to end racism. And they highlighted the very white Anglo landscape that didn't resonate with kids who weren't white. Is representation and diversity a significant issue in making TV shows that truly reflect our multicultural Australia?
Yeah, it's a really good.
White people here talking about that, but if you
that is true. Yeah, no, it's a really good point, and I think that broadcasters, the game has shifted quite significantly over the last few years, and that's true of the broadcasters who are expecting, when they commission work, for a much more diverse, both behind the scenes and in front of the scenes, landscape of people that are operating in the market, but also the type of support that funding agencies are providing to get into and work with maybe a broader range of people. I think that some of the challenge, and I don't want to oversimplify the challenge here, but I think that what you've tapped into, we're talking about Erik mentioning a sort of a challenging environment for people to operate in because of the uncertainty associated with that. It also lends itself to maybe a type of person who's maybe more stable or has more financial stability, or type of, I'm not suggesting that's true of Erik necessarily, but the people who have been attracted to the industry have been able to have greater maybe opportunities to sort of take on board the risks. So the de-risking our industry also encourages new people to come into it. But I think it's a measure also of being open and embracing and ensuring that there are opportunities for people in both the stories and the authenticity of the community, of what we're communicating as an industry. But that requires a lot of people, and I think it's shifted significantly over the last few years, and maybe that's true of what you've seen as well, Erik, behind the scenes, also in the type of casting that happens now, compared to what it was when you would have started out.
Like you say, it's really only been over the last half a dozen years, perhaps, if that the conversation, like with Aftertaste, the diversity of our cast was spoken about at ground level. We started talking about it at that point. It's not something that you tack on at the end. It's something that is, and I think that's right across the board at the moment. That's something that is at the forefront of all the conversations I've been party to in that area. So it is changing. There's a lot of developments happening, a lot of really positive developments happening, and happening quickly, and way, and not before time as well. But it is happening.
Yeah, and Matthew, I was just going to ask to follow up on that. It seems to me like a lot of the most exciting and new kind of voices and productions are coming from people of colour, particularly people from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. Black comedy on SBS I love, and is one that's
love it. Yeah.
But things like Mystery Show, even at the moment, I can't handle anything intense at the moment, so I've been watching that amazing new show. It's just like a doco, Back to Nature, and it struck me that that's a nature documentary in a way that I've never seen one presented before. But in terms of de-risking, it seems to me that it is the ABC and SBS who have that kind of institutional support, or who are pushing it. But is it wider than that in the industry?
I think it's worth us mentioning actually what you just said about the Indigenous storytellers, and we tapped it at the start, that over 20 years, the Australian Film Commission, which became Screen Australia, has invested in an Indigenous stories that have started to be told in more and more sophisticated ways. So we're seeing some of the most exciting storytelling and interesting cultural points that are a point of difference for us globally coming from our Indigenous storytellers. And I think that's true of Maori culture in New Zealand as well. There's many interesting things that are happening there. But it's also the juxtaposition of different cultures in Australia. We're a very multicultural country. We can't avoid that. And so if you're being in any way business focused around the idea of where your audience is, there's an obvious important role to be authentic in the story, but to be working and trying to get an audience appeal across many different parts of the landscape. Now, to your question around who's doing this, one of the shifts, you're right about ABC and SBS, they've always been sort of pushing and market leaders. CBS and 10, the network 10, has also been quite for driving this, and I think that's also leading to all the commercial networks that moving this direction as well. So that's been really interesting watching it, and I think the global streamers, to give absolute credit, they are operating in a global environment in which this became a very big international conversation, probably built, if anyone was watching the Academy Awards a few years ago, it was like, we've got to do something about the fact that our industry is very one-dimensional. And so I think that they are requiring, and in a really good way, that our kind of the commissioning work and the industry's work be a lot more diverse, perhaps. And I think that it's kind of who's leading this conversation, and the industry needs to respond partly to what it's being commissioned. So I give credit to the commissioners driving this conversation, really, because that's where we need to go, because they are the ones with the money, effectively, to drive the story.
And just another recommendation before I go, I've been rewatching The Family Law, which I think you can get on SBS on demand if people are looking for a lovely comedy during lockdown. The next question that I've got is, hang on, I accidentally moved the questions down. The next question that I've got is from Stephen Masters, who says, why are the Australian arts and entertainment sectors apparently so servile to foreign interests, effectively leaving the local industry with crumbs? And I guess it's similar to another question here about asking how you negotiate with these big streamers. Do you bargain directly with them, or are you relying on the government to kind of set the rules? Matthew, I might give you that one first.
Yeah, and Eric, you probably have to deal with this as your business grows and you're dealing with that tense conversation. Look, I think that they are connected in that if you don't have a framework in which we're operating, it puts it puts us at a disadvantage, right? Because there is every reason why if we can't cut a good deal that is essentially for the benefit of the people who are commissioning us, and maybe give them everything they want as part of that commercial transaction, then they can up stumps and go somewhere else. It's not, they don't have to be in this market. And I think we've always been, the starting question was, why are we sort of maybe servile to international interests? I mean, we're trying to not be, essentially. We want to be partners. We want to be balanced in our partnerships. We don't want to be begging and pleading for these people to be operating here. We want to make sure that there's an ongoing interest and that there's a comfortable requirement, because I think the issue is that people might talk the talk at the moment, but then business interests change in a couple of years, or someone's got a particular focus on Mexico, or that the exchange rate in Canada goes up, or something else is operating, so that as a global business, they're going to make the first decision usually about the money side of that business, and it's going to go. Whereas we want a longer operational commitment to being investing and working in Australia. I think that then sets up a dynamic that's a bit more balanced in trying to cut deals. But the reality is that these deals are really very difficult for local businesses and the producers to be having at the moment. And there's a global conversation about those deals, because other territories are having to intervene in the market as governments to set either a framework directly around what that deal should look like, or the length of the rights that are given to people when they commission the content, so that some of the work resides back with the businesses to then be able to on-supply the resources back to the creators. So it has required a government to intervene, and we think that's probably going to need to happen in Australia. At the moment, the only sort of kind of umpire at the table is sometimes when an agency like Screen Australia is investing with the production company, others in the picture, they get to say, well, you are not going to get my money unless you play fairly. And you've got to give some back, and you've got to kind of, but otherwise, the starting point can be, well, take it or leave it. And you're not going to get any margin or upside, and in fact, people will compromise their fees just to make the project, which is a terrible situation, because a lot of people end up in a lot of debt, and for a risky proposition that maybe people don't realise that perhaps the stress and strain on the sector, because it's like going into a really difficult operational exercise over a tight period with a group of highly skilled people, and there's a lot that can go wrong, and invariably things do go wrong, and often that means that some people, usually the producers, aren't paid necessarily as part of that process. So there's a great deal of risk that can play out if you haven't got a sort of a fair deal going on behind the scenes with all of the people that are working on the project.
Just to go to, I guess, a different point apart from local content stuff, I've got a question here from Jared Noonan, who's from Media Super, who says that Media Super has been underwriting the Australian film and TV series for nearly 10 years via the producer offset scheme. And can we do more to work on the streaming services or pressure government to oblige them stop taking a free ride? So are there other mechanisms there, I guess, available?
Erik, do you want to tackle that one, or do you want me to?
No, that sounds like your area.
All right.
Numbers and money.
Okay, so yes, a shout out to Jared, who is someone who's been supporting the industry through the industry's media fund, which is Media Super. What Media Super do, there's a borrowing scheme essentially that Media Super underwrites in different ways to be able to help provide liquidity to businesses that wouldn't otherwise be able to get the money to basically start to put the projects together, to then fund all the people on set to create the work, and then they get paid back. So there's kind of a way of having an opportunity for the industry to be supported through super, which is not a bad thing. And but to reassure people, it's a very riskless exercise for anyone that is in the Media Super. So there's a balancing thing. Look, what other sort of support can happen? I think that there's obviously a conversation directly with government that people need to have about either there's three or four triggers that support the industry. One of them is this regulatory framework and making it fair and reasonable across lots of businesses that are supplying content to Australians. So people want to have a fair in level playing field, and honest conversation about, well, you're doing this, you should do some of this. Then there's the conversation about the degree to which our national broadcasters are supported by our government, and people, if they care about the ABC and the SBS as institutions, they can also be forthright with the government and say, look, these are really important institutions. I think most people, Australians, really do back the national broadcasters because they are critical to developing and working with the sector as a sort of a baseline of investment. And Erik's talked about his experience on Aftertaste. That's probably, there's many examples where they lead and talent grow, and then they end up on lots of different services. And the other two conversations are about the financial investments. One of them is through Screen Australia on a federal level, but every state government also has little pockets of money that the South Australian Film Corporation probably is friends with Erik, because that's a bond that you make. But people realising that when those institutions operate well, they are curating talent, they're kind of working behind the scenes and helping to develop an industry and for all the benefits that come. And there's also the final point is the tax credit that is given to both to international productions that come to Australia, but also to Australian productions. And that is a way of, as I said before, it's sort of de-risking some of the projects, and in a part, but it also builds money. Domestic and international projects all have international money that come to them from other parts of the world, and they often need that trigger of someone going, well, I'm first in, there's money at the table here, all right, there's security in us putting in some money here and here and here, and that builds the project up, because otherwise you're dealing with bespoke R&D exercises usually that are potentially fraught. You don't always know that a show is going to work, and we don't often talk about the ones that don't work, but in fact Australia's very lucky because most of the shows work quite well. And yeah, so there we go.
I was just going to say, Erik, I just wanted to pick up on that idea of talent that Matthew was just talking about. We've got a question in here from Rachel, who says it seems like Australian TV acts as a bridge for a lot of actors to then get into larger scale films in Hollywood and elsewhere. We've obviously seen a pipeline of Neighbours and Home and Away stars, but how important is a strong TV industry in terms of then crossover into film and other areas for things like making sure you've got all the crew, well trained and supported, as well as a bridge to bigger things?
Well, it would be great if those bigger things were here. Really, that's the big thing, is that I think the ceiling, you get to a certain point, and of course America is a massive brain drain. Where people head over there, they get to a certain point here, they want to go over there. And as we saw during the pandemic, a lot of the LA-based Australian actors all came back to Australia and have been working here quite consistently for the last year or so. But I think, obviously, I suppose our business, I think it's a maturity thing. I mean, when I was a younger actor, I see things as stepping stones to something bigger. Maybe if I do that, maybe I'll get an opportunity over here. And then the longer I've done it, the more I realize that they're not stepping stones; they're experiences that I want to make the most of. So I'm no longer thinking about what might be generated out of the work. It's more just a case of, I came to Australia from New Zealand. I was cast in a production over here, and Australia represented in many ways what America represents for Australia now, is just a bigger area to expand and for more opportunities to be developed. So I think to bring it back to what we were discussing with the streamers and funding and everything, I think if there was a more consistent pipeline of funding and productions that are being made here, then you wouldn't lose people as quickly as you do. And on that note too, I think it's important that if there's a lot of pressure on productions these days to, you might get Australian writers, Australian directors, Australian crews, Australian production companies, and then you get to casting and it's like, oh, we need some Americans, or we need some Brits. We need to give this production a bit more kudos, a bit more international sellability. And I think at that point, And it happens all the time when you suddenly get the leads cast out of the UK or the leads cast out of America. I think, from standing up for the actors at the moment, it really would be great for us to push through, because again, and someone mentioned in the chats about, we all talk about the Muriel's weddings and stuff, and they were a long time ago, but they didn't take unknown actors and make them the Tony Collettes and the Rachel Griffiths. They took the Baz Luhrmanns and made him the international star that he is. And they were unknown people. They were simply good and good at telling their stories. So I just think that we just need more opportunities and consistency. And I think, and that's hopefully what we're trying to get at here with increasing the responsibility of the streamers to perhaps put up some cash. And that's the government's responsibility to make those systems workable.
Yeah. Just quickly, Matthew, I've got a couple of questions here about what the rules are around children's television and local content and advertising and things. Is there anything special there that people should know about?
Yes. They should know that there are 0 rules to deliver kids content now in Australia to Australian audiences, which is really quite surprising. What happened was that there had been rules for 7, 9 and 10 to deliver content, and then at the start of the year they were removed as a specific children's obligation. So and there hasn't been obligations on our national broadcasters ever to really actually have to deliver local content to local Australian content to to Australian audiences. And we think that it's a big problem, because as you mentioned, you tapped into it, that the concern, and it's been a concern that I've worked in government agency, and that concern was very evident right from the start, that people want their children to have an experience of understanding Australia. They want the play schools, they want the Blueies, they want the, in the day, Round the Twists or Henderson Kids or whatever it was that, we're watching. And so I look that it goes to the heart of whether the rules that need to be put onto the streaming service need to have a part set aside for audience content that's Australian, that is aimed at children, targets and has an Australian children's voice that appeals to that level of development and understanding. Because what generally happens is that it's a risky exercise we're talking about, because it's got money and people. Children's content can be sometimes seen as a even more riskier exercise, because it's potentially a smaller market. It may not work. And your point about advertising, whoever the questioner was raising, is that part of the reason it hasn't been a particularly promoted exercise on commercial television is that there are strict rules around how you advertise in that environment. And so that they weren't easily monetizable. And as the pressure on 7, 9 and 10 has mounted as a business, they've wanted to remove the obligations around children's content, because it's a harder thing to make money from. Now, that means, of course, if you haven't got children's content, though, where they're going to go? They're going to go to YouTube, which has got full of advertising. So I think we need a space. And look, the ABC, having said that they don't regulate, it's not regulated, they do this, voluntarily, and they do a great job. And NRTV particularly as well has been doing some great Indigenous kids stories. But again, we're talking about the safeguards in the system that stop us, in a long sense, having to doubt whether or not a management person will change this, or a commissioner in Netflix will not like us, or all that money has to be sort of begged from it. It's long-term planning that we're trying to deal with at the moment as a big tectonic shift happens. And maybe to contextualize for people, one other point that I think is really interesting is that we had a really burgeoning and exciting production industry when we kicked off right in the start, 1920s. And as structural changes happened around cinemas, and they were owned and bought by foreign interests, usually, they started to put in their own productions. And when broadcasting started in Australia in the 60s, we could sort of take control of that environment, because basically if the cinemas are showing, as they generally do. Quickly, basically, we've got the same challenge where you've now got systems of coming into the market, like whether it's Disney or Netflix, or that you've got to create a space for Australia in those environments where everyone's watching.
And I know people were saying that some of the movies I cited were older, but I've certainly loved the idea that Bluey has bestowed upon international audiences the lexicon of a tactical we and biscuits instead of a cuss word. So I'm hoping that goes out into the universe far and wide. It's certainly in my family with my nieces. Thank you so much, Matthew and Erik, for joining us today. Thank you everyone for your wonderful questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all, but I know the Australia Institute is really interested in making sure we've got a strong arts and entertainment sector. So I'm sure this won't be the last webinar that we do on this issue. Next week, please join us for a big week of climate change webinars. On Tuesday, we'll be talking to Saul Griffith, the Victorian Minister Lily D'Ambrosio, and the New South Wales Energy and Climate Minister Matt Keane about rewiring Australia. And on Wednesday, we'll be speaking with the Prime Minister of Samoa as part of our inaugural Pacific climate dialogue. So please, you can find those up on the website and join us for those next week. That's of course as we head to Glasgow. Thanks so much for joining us today, everyone. We hope to see you next week. Thanks again to Erik and Matthew. Stay safe, get vaccinated as soon as you can, and binge watch as much TV as you need to make it through lockdown. Thanks everyone.
And go for a tactical wee.
Thank you.
See you later. Bye.